Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right, time to talk about another book. My guest today is Sriram Balasubramanian. Sriram is a well known economist and author. His areas of interest include global macroeconomic, socioeconomic trends in emerging markets, and Indian Dharmic culture. He has written for several international publications such as Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and Vox EU, amongst others. As an independent columnist, has been an independent panelist on multiple TV channels. You might have seen him on CNBC TV 18. He has authored two books. Jamba, The Joint Family, shortlisted for the third annual IAAC Literary Festival organized by the Indo-American Arts Council, and The Wizards, which has been featured in various publications, including The Hindu. He used to be an international junior chess player and is an alumni of Columbia University, New York. He lives in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. But today we're talking about his new book, which is Kautilyanomics For Modern Times. And we're going to be talking about it in detail. Sriram, welcome.
Namaste, Kushal. Great to be on your podcast. I've been a silent fan of your podcast for some time. And it's the wide range of topics that you discuss and also the different perspectives you bring to the table is something very welcoming. On a lighter note, I'm also curious to know whether the Punjabi or the Mumbaiker or the Canadian Kushal is going to come in this show.
Everything. Everything. My only request is please don't be a silent supporter.
And more than that, I'm also worried that my minimal understanding of Hindi would be a deterrent. But anyways, let's see.
Nah,
But on a more serious note, I think it's a great podcast. I love the variety. And I think one thing that I really like about the show is even though, you have a different perspective on things, I think there's a very healthy sort of engagement of ideas, which I've seen. And that is something I really appreciate. So yeah,
Thank you
great
very
to be
much.
here and glad to discuss about the book.
Thank you very much. Well, as far as this podcast is concerned, 98% of the content is in Hindi. So, sorry, English. There is a reason why I kept it in English is because I did not want to alienate the diaspora who may not know any Indian languages. Second generation, third generation Indians who may not know any Indian language, and also I did not want to alienate Southern Indians because I wanted to create a product and a podcast for a global landscape and also all Indians. Unfortunately, it suffers in the views because of that in a way, because I stick to English, but it's okay. It is what it is. So I appreciate the kind words. So maybe we'll start with this. Why did you feel the need to write this book? Right? I mean, your previous two works were more technical, I guess, because you are an economist, you're a full-time economist. So why? How did the interest into, I guess, the cultural aspect and blending it with something like economics come from? Where did you come up with that thought?
Yeah, thank you, Kushal. So just to start off with, I mean, these are my personal views. They're not really of any organization I'm affiliated to, but the book itself was sort of a personal endeavor. I mean, as an economist, we are used to working on data sets and basically data, economic data, and economic analysis, right? So and we publish papers, publications, and then research, sort of gets picked up in policy. Policy sort of uses this to execute their ideas, and then it impacts the Aam Aadmi, right? So in that context, I chanced upon Angus Madison's research work. I mean, for your listeners, Angus Madison was one of the world's leading economic historians. And he produced a data set, multiple versions of the data set under the aegis of the Norwegian Research Institute, which basically gives you a data set from 0C onwards till about 1,000 years in terms of economic progress, till about 19th, 20th century. So he gives you GDP data, GDP per capita data, and he argues he's done an extensive research process. So I was working by chance on the data set. So it sort of came to me at that time. And coincidentally, also, I was learning Sanskritam as part time, just as a fascination, because I used to learn it when I was young. Uh, and another coincidence is that the Arthashastra text somehow came to me at that time. So my understanding was, before reading the text, I thought Arthashastra. So Artha basically, I think that the name itself tells you that it's going to deal with wealth, the wealth creation, and economics and policy and things like that. So I sort of started to sort of analyze and try to see the research, literature on the Arthashastra. And what really fascinated me is most of the discussion, if not all of the discussion, was either on the Chanakya Niti side, the political side, and the defense sort of policy side. And then you had folks like Dr. Pillai writing about, say, Chanakya for the business mind, sort of self-help books, which have, done great service. And then the fictional side, which Ashwin and a few others have written, right? But the basic question to me was, what is the artha part of all this, right? So if it was supposed to be defense policy, it probably should have been Rashtrasastra, or Rajya Shastra, for example, if it's just on statecraft. There's a reason why it's the Arthashastra. So when I was connecting all these three dots, I had an intuitive understanding that the progress, say, from Common Era onwards, right, had an underpinning of an economic sort of framework, right? So that was my intuitive understanding or intuitive feel, right? I come from the south, so from Tamil Nadu, basically. If you look at the temples in Tamil Nadu, for example, the Chola temples, they're all marvels, engineering marvels, which are even difficult to replicate today, right? So if people at that time had that level of thinking, my intuitive sense was they also would have a sort of an economic perspective. And I felt that Kautilya's Arthashastra could be a good segue to sort of understand that flow first of all, if there's a commonality in their approach, and secondly, what is the sort of framework that Kautilya had. So this, to sort of summarize it, this sort of got me motivated to look into this. And my further motivation was when I found nothing on the subject. There is just like two books, one by Balbir Sihag, which I mentioned many times, sort of a theoretical book. Balbirji is a one-man army, in my view, on this subject, because he's done so much work. And this is probably the second or third book on the subject. So the fact that, you had to sort of really dig deep sort of motivated me to look at this further. And I thought that'd be a novel exercise for people to sort of get a perspective on this. So this is broadly how, this sort of came about.
So I just was interested in understanding this. When somebody is reading the Arthashastra, how much of which school of economics they come from affects their reading and understanding of the Arthashastra itself?
Yeah, that's a fair question, right? I mean, more than that school, I think which school of even ideology that it comes from also matters. I mean, in terms of how you view it. The challenge here really is the text covers a wide range of areas, right? So these areas are sort of split across the chapters. You see, the chapters are not segregated. Even, for example, within law and order, there are various areas of, say, contractual obligations, which are related to economic policy, which are sort of intertwined in these chapters, right? So for a particular subject expert, so the individual has to have the subject expertise, and the individual has to have either Sanskritam knowledge or work with Sanskritam scholars to sort of get the poetic text and the interpretations, translations from it, and then contextualize it to what we are seeing today, right? So answering a question, I think economic ideology or thinking does matter, but what I attempted to do here is I sort of forgot the frameworks itself in the first place. So what I did was I tried to focus on outcomes. right? Meaning, what were some of the outcomes of policies that he did, right? And then derived a framework away from it. I mean, from it, right? So that way, I sort of try to negate the bias that inherently I might have, say, towards a particular perspective, right? Because when you read translations, there are about 3 to 4 translations, main translations, very few for a subject of this much discussion, but uh, some of them come with this inbuilt sort of biases. So I think it plays a role, but in this particular case, I tried to sort of subconsciously move away from that and try to sort of look at outcomes and then derive a framework.
Fair enough. Now let's start with a fundamental thing that in the beginning of the book itself, you mentioned this. You talk about a very specific things where you talk about different schools of economics. So I think it's in the first 50 pages of the Kindle version. I think it was page 22. Yes, page 22. So I'm reading your quote. You say, as a caricature in a pure form of socialism which doesn't exist anywhere in the world, all decisions are taken by the state, the government. The Bharatiya template of dharma or governance offered a third alternative. Some decisions were taken by individuals, some decisions were taken by the government, and some decisions were taken by the king government. That comes across clearly in this volume. Now, I have a question about this third way that is often spoken about. I mean, I know many people talk about the third way. I think even Ram Madhavji in his book on Deendayal Upadhyay, Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay, one of the chief ideologues of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, they also have spoken about this third way a lot. But it, like, is there a third way? When I read Deendayal Upadhyay's works, I'm not saying it is Arthashastra, so please don't misunderstand me. Like, I think Deendayal Upadhyay's way is pretty much socialism. I don't know what else to call it. I mean, it is socialism, but I want to call it something different because I don't know. I have an allergy to something, and I have a lot of respect for Deendayal Upadhyay and integral humanism. But like, what is this third way? Like, so I mean, as we're speaking right now, we are in North America, right? And these societies are built on largely laissez-faire policies, but are they really free markets in the truest sense? I mean, in Canada, there is so much redistributionism. There is free healthcare. There are so many other things. But in certain, even in America, you have Medicare, Medicaid, stuff like that, and many kinds of different redistributionism. Let's say if you are in the state of California, there is heavy redistributionism, higher taxes. Okay, maybe you go to Texas, it's a different story. But like, when we talk about the third way, my grouse has always been that there is no descriptive third way explained by anyone from our side, aka the Indians.
Yeah, that's a fair point. See, let me try to give you a perspective of what I learned from Kautilya, right? Because on the others that you mentioned, to be really honest, I've not read them enough to sort of give a perspective. But purely on what I've seen on Kautilya, you're right. See, there's no, even in a completely laissez-faire society, right? Very idealistic laissez-faire society. Even in the 90s, when it was completely laissez-faire in some countries, obviously the state still played a role. It's not like the state was non-existent, right? So it is always a gradation between the state and the market, right? So even in a, say, completely sort of a Keynesian worldview, where you believe that the state plays a more sort of an intervening role, and you sort of invest, you put in stimulus, the state intervenes to sort of make economic decisions. The market still plays a role. It might be a lesser role in that sort of ecosystem. The same the other way around. If it's a laissez-faire sort of society, even if you believe that markets are self-correcting on their own completely, you still have the state to sort of facilitate certain services, whether it's health or other sort of services. So the first point is there is no complete binary of this, in my view, right? It's a amalgamation at some level, right? But I think what this idea of Dharmic capitalism, which I sort of show in the book, or at least ideate in the book according to what Kautilya thinks, is the role of dharma sort of playing a self-correcting mechanism to both the state and the market. Because in other systems, I'm adding another variable, put it that way, into, or Kautilya would add another variable, in my view, into this mix, so as to facilitate both the state and the market. Because if there is an issue with the state, say there is corruption, for example, right, or there is inefficiency in, say, public delivery service, right? So what do we do in today's times? You look at ways to make that better. You look at the state, try to streamline the state, or do something to fix that. The same thing with the market. Market's not doing something well. But what Kautilya sort of believed was the idea of dharma and the components of dharma. If those things are enhanced and sort of say developed within society, then it makes a self-correcting far easier for both the state and the market. You don't need, say, huge cyclical differences between how societies function when dharma is placed as a foundational role. So I think, answering a question, I think this tries to bring another dimension to this debate, of this binary debate. Because if you look at issues that we're dealing with, say, 15, 20 years down the line, whether it's on demography, whether it's on climate change, most of these issues, I think, to my mind, are behavioral issues in some level. And I think that's where this sort of an approach, a Kautilyan sort of an approach, could be valuable. And I think in terms of practical implementation of this idea, you're right. There is no sort of model, because besides the ancient times, in recent memory, last 100 years, no one has sort of executed this at the ground level, right? So we don't have a sort of an analytical sort of data to sort of substantiate this. But I do think this can add another dimension to the debate.
You know what I found fascinating when I was reading your book, and maybe I want to get into Dharmic capitalism, but for a later
Sure.
time period. But I want to start. You mentioned the environment. Now, what I liked about Kautilya's way, and maybe you can explain his way of looking at the environment, is, the classic laissez-faire way has always come out as, exploitative. That these are resources that I need to exploit, and I need to convert them into a product where I make money of. Not that I have a problem with making money, I like a lot of it. But the point is that the Kautilya way, from what I have understood through your book, and at least you're trying, and correct me if I've misunderstood it, that it was not an exploitative look, it was a complementary outlook.
Yeah.
That this is a scarce resource, point number one. It looks at it as a limited resource. Now, the debate could be done whether it's a limited resource or not, but that's not the point. I'm just trying to state what you have presented. And now that it is a limited resource, you should add in certain uh, regulatory mechanisms through the state, and certain nudges through the state, which creates the overall uh, environment and the archetype, which is basically, it's more towards complementarity than exploitativeness. Have I misunderstood it?
Yeah, I should have you as a PR for my book. Because that was really well said. I mean, that's you really hit it on the nail, right? Because what he sees is even the idea of dharma, right? We view the idea of dharma in most cases as a sort of a spiritual, not spiritual, sort of a way of life, which eventually, sort of leads you into into another zone, right? But what Kautilya does is he sort of uses this brilliant idea to sort of do what you just mentioned. That, take the idea of environment. You take the idea of forest, for example, right? He talks a lot about forest protection, right? So his argument for forest protection is twofold. One is for the environment, okay, the Swatchh and protection of cleanliness, whatever it is, natural resources, indriyangal and all these things. And then another is he needs forest for defense, sort of, those type of purposes, to sort of, enhance his statecraft, right? So what he does is he understands these resources are scarce. You're right. So he tries to sort of view it through the prism of responsibilities, which I've also sort of, mentioned, both at a societal level and at an environmental level, through the idea of nudges. So he brings these, sort of dharmic nudges as concepts, which sort of stimulates people to look at a bigger picture. Because unless, take in the environment, for example, unless you or me are sort of convinced by the idea of protecting a particular environment, right? Whether it's your own house or your lawn or your park in your neighborhood, you're not going to get outcomes that are favorable unless you, as individuals, you're convinced. So that's where he sort of uses these nudges to sort of get home that point. So yes, you're right. I think his idea is to, at least from my interpretation of his idea, is whether it is on biodiversity, whether it is on civic responses, personal hygiene. He talks a lot about the Swatchh part of Dharma. All of it, he sort of aligns it through a set of either regulations or nudges, as you mentioned. And if it's a regulation, it's strict, right? It's sort of it is enforcing if you violate the regulation. And in terms of nudges, he sorts of gets your tries to use some of these techniques to sort of get people to be on board. So you're right. I think that is a sort of a way that he sort of approaches, because I think fundamentally he believed on the welfare of the people, right? And he was, I think, astute enough to understand the welfare of the people is sort of is accomplished, or is it becomes people's welfare is taken care only if they're sort of convinced by some of these policies. So that's where I think he uses a combination of these two, which you mentioned.
So, you use the example of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan of the current Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, and you use that as an example. So my question to you, I was just wondering, we did not discuss this on WhatsApp, but it just cropped up in my brain, so I wanted to talk to you about it. Uh, do you consider the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan to be like classical Kautilyan in that sense? Because in the case of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the government is investing money too, right, in building the shauchalayas. They're going ahead and giving 12,000 rupees to every person who is participating in this entire movement towards cleanliness. So while the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan is what you would call in the sense of Kautilya a classical nudge, yes, I agree with you there. But then, would Kautilya have also invested money in building those washrooms with the members of the citizenry?
Yeah, that's a nice question. See, the idea of getting that part is to sort of contextualize on the nudge part of it, because essentially, let's not get into the dynamics of Swachh Bharat, success, not success, forget about it, right? If you really look at the idea is you sort of get to your inner sort of dharmic consciousness of cleanliness, and then say you are clean, you want the society to be clean, therefore you live a much more holistic life, for example, right? That's a direct nudge. If you are able to through a variety of mechanisms, say mass media, leadership of the government, and people like that, triggering that consciousness, right? And then what it does is it then scales up, and then individuals get ownership, and then you have a campaign which sort of invest in things like toilets and whatever that you're saying. I think what Kautilya would have done is he would have definitely done the first part of it, which is triggering the consciousness, right? And sort of creating an awareness among people, and then initiating this exercise. But I think what he would have done is, in terms of investment, he would have probably focused on areas which require investment rather than across board, right? Meaning, say there is 35% below poverty or 30% below poverty, he would have probably invested in all this for that section of people, right? For the others, he might have still gone with the campaign and sort of, because he believed in sort of targeted support for people who were really needy among the lower income sections. So in my sense, I think he would have probably not gone on the scale that we are talking about, but he would have sort of invested this in a much more focused group. And then once that group sort of evolves, he probably would move to the next stage rather than going at, one sort of stretch.
Another point that I wanted to talk to you about is, and in fact, this is something that annoys me the most as an Indian who deals with Western viewership also. When I say Western viewership, I don't mean Indians living in the West like you and I are right now. I'm talking about westernized people. Now, they could be of Indian origin, like second generation, third generation Indians too. They're basically westernized. Is this caricature created out of India of otherworldliness? Of people who are very fatalistic. I don't know. 20 years since I've been traveling back and forth to the West, nothing annoys me more than that. Honestly, I mean,
Yeah.
the cows and curry doesn't bother me. This bothers me. This personally bothers me. Is like, at least as a personal Cārvāka, I was like, ek to we gave you the damn materialism before you're Epicurus. First of all, we actually
Yeah.
came up with it. We came up
Yeah.
with it.
You're right.
And dharma, artha, kama, moksha literally has artha and kama. What are you, blind or something? So let's stick to this. Like, there is a quote in your book that you have written over here. Kautilya's emphasis on material prosperity and his advice that the ruler's happiness lies in ensuring the welfare of the people seems to emanate from this very idea. You're talking about something specific in the book, but I want to focus on the first part. That literally means human flourishing, or which the Westerners use a Greek term to use Aristotle's term. Aristotle used to call it eudaimonia. So everything that they would judge was on the basis of eudaimonia, human flourishing. Now, the Indian way is slightly more nuanced. The Indian way is, yes, human flourishing is a subset,
Correct.
but it has to be based on the principles of dharma. Now, can you explain what Kautilya's view was on human flourishing?
Now, see, he is a very, uh, you know, context agnostic guy. So that's another term which I often use because you need to understand the Arthashastra text itself. The text itself doesn't mention about any particular king. It doesn't mention about any particular sort of ritual. It says, he is against foretelling astrologers. He's against people who look at the stars for, you know, for governing, for example. It is like a sort of a textbook purely, which is sort of agnostic away from all these things. It's context agnostic also, right? So you're right. Kautilya, his personal views on these things might be varied, but the text itself, it is meant for anyone and everyone, right? And you're very right. I mean, it annoys me as well because we have a lot of, theistic, atheistic traditions within the Dharmic fold. In fact, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, there are folks who are following the Mimamsa way of life. The Mimamsa way of life they don't even look at a particular god. Vedas, for example, is their sort of, end all of life, and they don't, and the Cārvāks is another example. And then you have a Sankhya, for example. You have a lot of these traditions which either don't believe in God or they don't believe in the entity of God as defined by, conventional faith, or their way of life is to just enjoy life at its, at the way it is. But they're all part of the four. And I think the reason why you have this fatalistic theory is, for some reason, it's been spread. I mean, the sense that because of the fact that you believe in rebirth, you sort of would fear everything. which, if you look at ancient times, evidence is contrary to this. I mean, and in Kautilya's case, but in his particular case, he was very early. I mean, he was very clear that unless there is economic prosperity, where which impacts people's welfare, which means benefits people's welfare at the base, and then the welfare is defined by economic prosperity. Unless you have this, you're not going to have other areas of statecraft, political dominance, or whatever it is, in a sort of a conventional life. So he was probably one of the earlier people to sort of understand this right away. But yeah, you're right. It also sort of amazes me when I keep sort of hearing this, and also the idea of globalization, right? I mean, if you really look at history, globalization was the norm. I mean, in terms of trade, in terms of you can define globalization in many ways, but I'm talking about basically interactions between societies of different religions and cultures. You could have Greeks writing about their travels across India during all this time. Chinese embassy notes talk about Chola interactions, talk about interactions with Cambodia. So trade was fundamental to our sort of historical worldview. And the era of socialism and all these things is a post-independent phenomenon. I think pre-independence, or at least our ancient history suggests that global sort of interaction with people was the status quo.
Yeah, I agree. And what is funny is like the Indus Valley was trading all the way with different civilizations at that time, and it's kind of naive, for some of these people to actually have such a stupid view. I'm not talking about the view at the scholarly level. This is, the tier 2, tier 3 that tries to read the scholar and disseminates the scholarly view down into a straw man. Like, I barely come across scholars who spew nonsense like this. Most of the times it is people who have read the scholars and then who write those, and the ones who read the ones reading the scholars and writing them down. So tier 3 is the worst. Tier 2 is semi horrible. Like, any serious person will not make such comments, but yeah, it is what it is. It just gets me. Now I want to talk to you about something that fascinated me the most in this particular book, was this whole minimum wage idea. Now we are used to the minimum wage as, okay, like for example, in America there is a minimum wage. Every state has a different minimum wage, from what I have understood. Every state decides, okay, as per our financial conditions, we are going to fix a minimum wage, but it is standard across all, right? I mean, everybody has to be paid this much. But can you talk about Kautilya's minimum wage? It was fascinating how his minimum wage was very, very, I mean, sometimes you feel, how much time did he have? He created a minimum wage for everything.
No, there's a table which I have in the book. Readers, please go buy the book. But there's a brilliant listeners, rather, please buy the book. But there's a table which shows the salaries for the staff. Say in a sort of a governmental setup, it goes from almost like 65 panas to all the way to 60,000 panas, right? He defines those categories for government employees, like how we have government salaries, right? So his idea was that if you're going to have a standard minimum wage of say $15, right? Let's take the $15 minimum wage today in America, right? The $15 minimum wage when inflation was at 2%, okay, is very different to when inflation is at 5-6%, right? So if circumstances change, the idea of this minimum wage also changes, right? Depending on how the other indicators are. The same thing for, in India, for example, where the rural urban gap is so huge. So you might have, there are lots of discussions to have a rural sort of a minimum wage and an urban minimum wage. And then you might even need someone in between the tertiary sort of tier 2, tier 3 cities, which aren't really rural, but aren't urban either, right? So Kautilya's idea was that you needed to have flexibility on this, right? Either in terms of time frame, meaning in 1 year, 2 years, have this sort of a wage, or in terms of income classification. So he believed that the poorest of poor sort of requires one rate, which is sort of, ensuring that they're not below poverty, for example. And then the middle class also would require a certain sort of support, but that would be graded and again depending on. And he believed the richer class doesn't really need support. But what I'm saying is he classified this in terms of income, and most importantly, he believed in the idea of being flexible. So he was open to changing this. At a conceptual level, he believed that a concept like this is required for policy, for people below a particular poverty line. But he believed it was sort of flexible, and he believed, I think, that it is something that needs to evolve and not at a fixed sort of prescription.
Now, one question so Matsya Nyaya. Now, if you look at it from a purely laissez-faire approach and today's market-oriented approach, honestly, beyond the purist, I think everybody follows what is classical Matsya Nyaya that Kautilya talks about, like what India is doing. India will decide which product can do business from outside. Every country does that. Like even the United States of America has so many protections when it comes to their farmers.
Right.
So there's nothing new. I mean, so Canada has protections for farmers. I know multiple protections are there. So everybody. So is Matsya Nyaya in that way the ancient age and much more robust protectionism?
No, I wouldn't say that, in the sense that, see, the idea of Matsya Nyaya in the book, which I articulate, is twofold, right? The one idea is on essentially the gap between the poor and the rich, right? The big fish and the small fish sort of a approach, where an idea of inequality, basically, right? So to sort of ensure that the gap doesn't become too big, Kautilya believed in some form of targeted redistribution, where he would target a particular, in today's terms, say he would target a particular category and then provide incentives or basic support for them. So that's one part of the Matsya Nyaya thinking of Kautilya. Another part is again in terms of business, right? You don't want, say, big businesses to sort of run over small businesses, right? So he sort of believed that the principle of Matsya Nyaya should be there in judicial sort of deliberations, where a small business owner should get the same sort of legal and swift justice on business issues compared to a sort of a big owner, a big business person. So he believed ease of business, that was one of the sort of components of ease of business from Kautilya's sort of point of view. So in both these cases, it's about the weak man or woman sort of not feeling not feeling run over by the state because of the fact that they're small, right? So I think his sort of an approach is, I wouldn't characterize it as protectionism per se. If protectionism, some form of protectionism, is required to achieve this objective, he might do that. But I think what his goal was to ensure that these two components of Matsya Nyaya are taken care, because he believed in the idea of ease of business quite significantly. I mean, one of his goals was to facilitate trade and to ensure that, for example, importers had a lot of tax breaks. People who are importing goods, they had security in terms of internal trade, like they had in those days, sort of support for people to move goods from one place to another. The state would provide support. It's called Vartani, which is a sort of a person or a group of people who provide support so that the goods are transferred internally properly. So since his goal was ease of business, his aim would be to sort of facilitate this process. So I think Matsya Nyaya should be viewed in that way. And one point which I didn't mention, I think I should also add here, is the idea of yogakshema. The Kautilya really believed in the idea of yogakshema in the sense that he believed that the world has to be a better place, and he believed that there has to be sort of even lokakshema and yogakshema, combination of both, where he says that society as a whole should go up, and the world should be a more better place, in general. So he sort of had that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get that with your protectionist sort of argument, is that when I'm thinking out loud, I'm sort of thinking out loud, I still feel this idea of Yogakshema and Lokakshema would overpower the idea of protectionism in his policy prescription, in my view. Again, it's a
Yeah,
trade-off, right? I mean,
yeah. So basically, again, the prism one has to look at is, again, for Kautilya, everything is about human flourishing, not at the cost of dharma.
correct.
And in human flourishing, sometimes you have to be restrictionist, sometimes you have to put those things because you believe it leads to the greater good, as they say. So I
Correct.
guess that's how one will look at it. Now, you talk about dharmic capitalism, right? Again, you say uh, the principles of dharmic capitalism, as you call it, they are three elements: are wealth creation, sustainable growth and welfare, and a rule based non-interventionist state. We've talked about sustainable growth, but now let us talk about a rule based yet non-intrusive state, because it sounds as if these are incompatible at times. You How do you be rule based and yet non-interventionist? It's kind of slightly complicated.
Yeah. So yeah, let me try to explain this a bit more. I think this is one of the areas where I really take on people who consider Kautilya to be a socialist sort of you know person, because what I mean by a rule based and non intervening state is the state has two major functions, right? Two, or at least for our reference. The first function is rule of law, right? You're going to have X 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 regulations. You violate certain regulations, you break the law, you get the punishment that's required, right? And then the punishment might be severe, but if you don't violate the law, you go on with your life doing whatever that you want, right? And the second function is the state intervenes in some of the things that you do in terms of day-to-day activities, right? Say, for example, you are having a water canal or a water reservoir in your in your land, right? The state can tell you, okay, the dimensions of this water reservoir should be only say X by X, like 100 by 100, right? That is an intervening state, right? Because it is intervening at the micro level of your activity that you're doing, right? What Kautilya does is, in my view, he has certain prescriptions, certain rules and regulations that are very strict. Some of the punishment is very severe. Okay. So, but those rules and regulations do not intervene at the level of micro activity when you are doing. So, for example, if you take the private sector, right? There used to be a private sector even those times. I mean, where the state activities beyond the state, where traders, for example, right? Traders are people who move from one place to another. They don't necessarily need to belong to the state, right? You would find it very rare where Kautilya determines the quantity of amount of, say, gold that's being traded, right? He might tell you, for example, I'm going to tax you this much for this much, amount of gold, and he might implement that rule to the hilt, right? But he is not going to sort of micromanage the way you do trade or the quantum of trade that you're doing, right? So I think that is the difference that I'm sort of laying it out, because a socialist state is a very micromanaging state. I don't think Kautilya is micromanaging. I think that's a misconception, because people tend to accuse him of being completely controlling, a state which completely controls whatever that's happening. That's not true. The state doesn't control. For example, there's very little in the Arthashastra which tells you what individual traders need to do, what products do you need to trade. you know if the state was so much controlling, he wouldn't have the idea of, say, even a private sector, because the private sector by nature does whatever that they want to do. There are lots of non-state entities at that time as well doing activities. And the last point is, it also comes to the idea of kingship, right? Kautilya clearly believed that the king was a mere servant of the people, right? The king's role, is not that of the Raja as we define. His idea was very clear: the king served the people. So the king is not doing a great job, or his kith and kin are not up to the task. Kautilya goes even says that he will replace him with someone who's more competent. So his idea of even kingship is not for it's aimed at the welfare of the people. What I'm trying to say is that if someone who focuses so much on the welfare of the people wouldn't want to constrain them to a completely controlled state. So my argument is he has a very rule enforcing and strict sort of regulation based state, but it doesn't intervene at every level of activity. It lays out the framework very well. You exactly know this is what is right. I mean, this is what is you can do. This is what you can't do. And if you don't do this, you're going to get crazy, punishments, whatever it is, according to those times. But it doesn't intervene into day-to-day activities. So that's what I sort of get to in that sense about the state which is strong but doesn't intervene.
So would I be right in saying that the key focus in Kautilya's worldview was accountability?
Correct.
I don't want to punish you. These are the rules. These are the bare minimum set of rules that I've set up over here. Certain areas, so even I remember when I read the Arthashastra, like he was hawkish when it comes to certain things like national security. He was very hawkish. He was like,
Correct.
there are just no rules. I will do whatever it takes to protect the state. On economics, he did not care. That he was
Correct.
very much he was like, do what you want to do, just don't bug me.
Yeah, see, the thing with Kautilya is, I mentioned this in the book as well. This book is not meant to pontificate about Kautilya, right?
Mhm.
I acknowledge that he's as flawed as you and me are, probably. Okay.
Yes.
And he himself acknowledges that. In fact, Kautilya says that that's why the first chapter, it's sort of dense, but the reason why I brought the first chapter is why we give a pre-Kautilyan perspective, is because he himself acknowledges a lot of these ideas came from other people, from Brihaspati, from Shukracharya. He, in fact, gives quotations where he says where he agrees with Brihaspati, where he disagrees with Shukracharya, for example, or vice versa in some of the text. So he is humble enough to acknowledge that a lot of the ideas in the Arthashastra are an agglomeration of set of ideas which came before, and some of its own ideas, right? So he he himself sort of acknowledges that he isn't sort of the perfect person that we are used to sort of thinking about ancient figures. So that's not the book acknowledges that, right? But since the breadth of the book is across a wide range of areas, he is a sort of he navigates various areas in different ways, and this book focuses purely on economics. So you might have, for example, in national security, that he does something which is completely contrary to this in terms of some of these things. So I think that basically depends on what positioning he is and what he wants to achieve based on this. But
Yeah.
purely on sort of on economic prosperity, I think his ideas on these things are fairly consistent.
Yeah. The thing that comes up with Kautilya is that the Dandneeti,
Right.
the enforceability of rules, is very high on the priority list for a Kautilya kind of a character. Like he is very clear. These are the rules. Better follow it. If you don't, I am coming for you. Now, whether the rules are harsh or not is not the point of the debate.
No, and yeah. So sorry to butt in. I just got a bit excited, but on again on our discussion prior, right, on the responsibilities against
Accountability.
a rule enforcing state, they can be complementary, and I think that's what
Yes.
Kautilya wants to achieve, in the sense he wants to use because he understands that the prism of responsibility is how society functions, right, in general, right, whether you like it or not. Because even today, I think in India, cultural norms sort of define a lot of economic interactions we make. So he believes that attribute can be used for a variety of things that will benefit his policies and his execution. But as you said, provided that the rule of law is also maintained. So it's not an you know one or the other, but rather complementing each other.
Yeah, yeah. That is what does come across in the case of Kautilya. And you know what, the thing is, you can always find flaws in everybody's views, but look, these were people of their time. I mean,
Right.
what do you expect, like some great discovery at that time? Why? And the same thing applies to you, because in 100 years maybe we'll be in Mars, and the people sitting in Mars are like, what took you so long, morons? Well, it takes time sometimes, it's like that. And we build on the mistakes that we learn from our ancestors, and we try to correct them, or we learn from them on the models that they have done very well. Now, this is a question that you directly ask in the book, and I think it's a very important question. Like, what is the value addition that Kautilya brings to economic thinking compared to other economic thinkers? That's a very important question. What is it?
Yeah. So I think it will be an extension of your the previous point, right? The previous point that you mentioned is what we can learn from, you know, ancient thinking, ancestral thinking, and things like that, right? One of the main aims of this book is that despite having this knowledge available, no one really has brought it to the table as it sort of deserves. So, the first aim of the book is for your listeners, yourself, and others sort of wake up to this, or at least come to grips with this, and then debate, discuss like what we're doing now, right? And the second question is, how does some of these things apply in today's times? So you need to first acknowledge that there was thinking which earlier which had some of these ideas, and next is you sort of think how you can use some of these ideas in today's times, right? The second part of the question is more tricky, because we already have established systems in today's way of functioning, right? So how do you sort of inculcate some of these values into established systems? If we take the case of India itself, right, in Bharat, so I think where there'll be a lot of value addition is in the idea of dharma and utilizing some of the concepts of dharma to have more efficient outcomes. Say, for example, let's go back to Swatch Bharat itself, right? For some reason, let's say we come to a conclusion that only 70% or 80% of Swatch Bharat is effective. You may want to make a jump between 80 to 90%, for example, right? You could use some of these sort of dharmic nudges in a more experimental way to sort of get home that point from the 80 to 90% of success in a particular policy. So I think where this sort of helps is it sort of helps in sort of making policy a bit more efficient and taking into account sort of the cultural fabric or sort of a dharmic fabric into policy making. Because often in sort of Asian societies, more so in India and China to an extent as well, there's a big disconnect between what happens on the ground, meaning what happens at our houses and homes, and what happens in say a policy that's being implemented. Take the case of dowry, right? Dowry was outlawed in India in 1955, if I'm not wrong, right? And all of us want dowry to be eliminated, sensible people. But the reality, dowry still exists in India, right? Whether we like it or not. So there is a legislation which has been done many years ago, but the effect has not been good enough to completely eliminate. So these type of principles, even on economic policy, could be correlated, where there's a gap between, for example, I mentioned about the sovereign sort of gold scheme. One of the reasons why the scheme didn't kick off in one survey was that many women felt that the gold that they deposit is so sort of, they're so attached to that gold because it has a much more bigger value to them, that they wanted the same gold back after the maturity of the bond. Right? When you give them a different gold, they feel that it's not worth it, so they don't invest in a sovereign gold bond. Right? So this sort of a characteristic. So what I'm trying to say is that you could use some of these ideas to further get into the characteristics of people and sort of have or facilitate better outcomes and make policies more efficient. I think that way these ideas will be useful to sort of think at it from that lens, rather than having a wholesale sort of structural uh, um, change or whatever it is. So you could create an index, for example, which is sort of facilitates like a sustainability index. You could have a sort of Dharmic coefficient index, for example. For you could do a variety of ways, but I think at a practical level, I think what would be helpful is use some of these ideas to sort of facilitate these nudges to enhance policy outcomes.
Yeah. So one last question, because this is kind of relevant to contemporary times before we wrap it up. Now, COVID has caused a serious problem across the world. Different countries have approached it in a different way. In fact, it's going to be one of my future podcasts too with a friend. But my question is Kautilya specific. Like, what was Kautilya's view on debt management? Like, how would the Kautilyan state manage debt? Because like right now we are going through some serious inflationary issues across the globe. Obviously there are multiple factors to it, but we cannot deny that COVID and the governments just blindly throwing money, especially governments in the West, just blindly throwing money, has led to some of it. Obviously the Russia Ukraine crisis has a major role to play in it too. But what was the Kautilyan way of looking at debt?
Yeah. So we I mean, there's a chapter, penultimate chapter in the book where we sort of look at this idea, say 15, 20 years down the line, of how for example, I myself was sort of asked questions to Kautilya. See, in Kautilya's case, there's a bit of a uh, say two ways to think about debt, right? One is personal debt, another is a sovereign's debt, right? So he believed that debt sustainability was very important at a personal level, where you had to sort of take calculated risks, but also ensure that repayments are done on time. There are significant fines if you don't repay properly. And there are also exemptions. I mean, for people who are disadvantaged, he sort of gives you exemptions. I even talk about the idea of sama dandabet in the idea of debt resolution, of how to resolve debt between, say, businesses and things like that. But in the case of sovereign, I think I'm still, in fact, thinking about that in my further discovery of Kautilya. One of the things because the idea of a sovereign is a challenge, right? I mean, even though Kautilya viewed it as a non-sovereign sort of kingdom, because the king, in his view, was still a facilitator of the people, uh, the sovereign norms that we have today, for example, in sovereign debt, slightly are variant. But from my interpretation of his ideas, I think what he would have done is he would have been much more targeted than giving money for everyone, for example, during the pandemic. I think he would have been far more restrained, bit more controlled in terms of the finances, and he would have probably looked for more sort of indigenous solutions to deal with such things, given the constraints of finances. So my sense is, at least from whatever that I've seen in his way of thinking, he would have made it more targeted, meaning provide income support to people only below a particular line, below a particular wage, people who have lost their jobs, for example, or people who need that support. And second, he would ensure that the finances of the sovereign is sustainable, because he also believed that the future generations shouldn't pay the the ilk of the current generation. And his idea of climate was also similar to that. So I think he would have been a bit more restrained, a bit more targeted, um, and also he would have looked at the long term more than the short term sort of exigencies. In fact, this is another area which I probably would explore, but I didn't go into it because it's not really economics. But he talks about even natural disasters, right? How do you sort of deal with natural disasters, and what are some of the things that the state needs to do if there's a natural disaster, for example. So I think the pandemic isn't something he directly probably mentions, but he talks about diseases also. So probably we could, take some ideas from that to see how he would approach this. But broadly speaking, I think he would have been a bit more restrained, a bit more targeted, is what I feel.
Fair enough. So before we wrap it up, Sriram, what is the next project that you are planning to get involved in?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a couple of things in my mind, but I think what I would like to do is to sort of complete what I had in mind, in the sense, my thinking was there's an economic framework, which I think from my reading of Kautilya, there is sort of a philosophy. I would like to what I'm doing is to sort of look at more common era extensions of this, and see how the connections are, if there are any, and then also see how people have modified, if they modified this particular framework for their sort of progress in common era, say kingdoms and things like that. Because another thing that fascinated me is you have inscriptions of the Arthashastra in Cambodia, for example. Near the Angkor Wat, there are many inscriptions of the Arthashastra which says quotations from the Arthashastra in those times, which means rulers of Cambodia also had some reference point to this text. So the question is how some of these were modified, if they were not. The same case with some of the kingdoms in the south. So and most of them were, the idea of dharma again resonated everywhere, if you had noticed, in general, in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of their upbringing. So I'm pretty sure it is also there in economic policy. So my probably next work would be, which I'm sort of started some work on, is to sort of understand this a bit more, and hopefully give you a flavored sort of approach of how some of the more common era kingdoms also evolved on this concept.
Awesome. Sounds good, man. I look forward to reading your next work too. This book was a lot of fun, and I wish you all the best. And hopefully, you go on writing about this, because Kautilya is kind of known as a foreign policy guy, but never looked at it from an economist perspective. So, congratulations on the book, and wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you, Kushal. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the discussion. And to your listeners, request you to buy the book, read it, and review it whenever you can. And feel free to reach out to me. I have my website, which you can just Google search if you have any queries. And I look forward to sort of further discussions on the subject. And there's also a contest for the reviews. Do you want to mention that?
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So guys, we have conceptualized the contest this time. So once you read the book, if you write the review on Amazon, so obviously Sriram is going to choose the two best reviews in that. So do not forget one thing: when you write the review, please remember to write your email ID below where you have written. Otherwise, how do we contact you? So do not forget to write your email ID. I repeat. So once you've read the book, you bought the book, you read the book, you write your review. The top two reviewers will be chosen by Sriram, and those two winners will be given an Amazon voucher of 25 USD each. Obviously, it's sponsored by Sriram. You guys can submit all your reviews, let's say by the 15th of September to 16th of September, and once all the reviews are considered, around 18th to 20th, Sriram will, obviously the ones who have won will be directly informed by the email, which is written below in the review. And I also will mention who the two people were on the community tab of my YouTube page. So there you go. And as always, remember, in the description of the video itself, you will have the link to buy the book. You can buy it on Kindle, or you can buy a hard copy. I'm a Kindle person. I know a lot of people don't like Kindle, so please buy the hard copy. And if you're listening to the audio version, the same thing applies. In the description of the podcast, you'll find it there. And as far as I'm concerned, you guys know the drill. You can subscribe to the Cārvāka podcast YouTube channel, or go and subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you are, and leave a review over there too for the podcast. You can also support the channel by becoming a member on YouTube or a subscriber on Patreon, and buy the Cārvāka podcast merch and send your donations using UPI. I will see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. Bye bye.